For years, Dubai existed as a promise, an engineered reality where wealth was not just accumulated, but displayed with surgical precision. Glass towers rose out of the desert like declarations. Artificial islands reshaped geography itself. And for a certain class of global elites, it felt less like a city, and more like a controlled environment where risk had been quietly removed. But something has shifted. In the past few years, a subtle but measurable pattern has begun to emerge. Quiet departures, assets being reallocated, residency statuses quietly downgraded, not in dramatic waves, but in deliberate, almost invisible movements, the kind that doesn't make headlines until it's too late to ignore. This isn't about a sudden collapse. There are no empty skyscrapers, no immediate crisis. On the surface, Dubai still performs wealth flawlessly. And yet, beneath that surface, a different story is unfolding. One that raises an uncomfortable question. What do the ultra-wealthy see that everyone else doesn't? Because when people with the most resources in the world begin to leave a place built specifically for them, it's rarely impulsive. It's calculated. And that calculation begins with something far deeper than lifestyle. To understand what's happening, it's necessary to step back, not into headlines, but into the structural mechanics that made Dubai what it is today. Over the past 2 decades, Dubai positioned itself as a frictionless node in the global economy. No income tax. Rapid company formation. Strategic geography between Europe, Asia, and Africa. For high-net-worth individuals navigating increasingly complex regulatory environments in the West, Dubai offered something rare. Clarity, or at least the appearance of it. Following the global financial crisis of 2008 and later the disruptions of the pandemic era, capital began to move differently. Wealth became more mobile, more cautious, and more sensitive to policy shifts. Dubai benefited from this transition. Between 2020 and 2022, the city saw a significant influx of millionaires relocating assets, businesses, and in many cases, their legal residency. Real estate transactions surged. Ultra-luxury property prices climbed at a pace that outperformed many traditional financial hubs. Entire districts began to reshape themselves around this influx, designed not just for living, but for signaling permanence. But beneath that expansion, a quieter layer of data began to diverge. By 2023 and into 2024, capital inflows had not stopped. But their composition had changed. The velocity of new arrivals began to slow. At the same time, outward capital transfers, particularly among ultra-high net worth individuals, began to increase, not dramatically enough to trigger alarm, but consistently enough to form a pattern. This is where the distinction becomes important. Dubai is not experiencing an exodus in the traditional sense. There are no mass sell-offs or visible declines in population. Instead, what's emerging is a rebalancing, where a segment of the ultra-wealthy is quietly reducing exposure, diversifying assets across jurisdictions, adjusting residency footprints, structuring their presence to be less anchored than before. In isolation, this might seem like standard financial behavior. After all, diversification is fundamental to wealth preservation. But the scale and timing suggest something more coordinated, not in communication, but in perception. Because the same individuals who once consolidated aggressively into Dubai are now fragmenting that presence. And the reasons for that fragmentation begin to appear when examining the broader global environment. Across Europe, regulatory frameworks have tightened. Transparency requirements have expanded. Tax regimes have become more sophisticated in tracking offshore wealth. Initiatives aimed at reducing financial opacity have increased pressure on individuals who rely on jurisdictional flexibility. At the same time, geopolitical uncertainty has reintroduced risk into regions once considered stable. Sanctions regimes, capital controls, and shifting alliances have made the concept of a safe haven more complex than it was a decade ago. Dubai, in many ways, thrived precisely because it sat outside these pressures, but no system exists in isolation indefinitely. As global financial systems become more interconnected, the advantages of any single jurisdiction begin to compress. What was once a clear arbitrage between regulation, taxation, and mobility starts to narrow. And when that arbitrage narrows, behavior changes. What we're seeing now is not a rejection of Dubai, but a recalibration of its role within a much larger portfolio strategy. A city that was once treated as a central hub is increasingly being repositioned as one node among many. And that shift, from centralization to distribution, tends to happen quietly. Because for those operating at the highest levels of wealth, visibility is rarely an advantage. But this raises a more human question. What does that shift actually look like from the inside? His name doesn't appear on public rankings. No interviews, no panels, no visible association with the typical symbols of wealth. And yet, for over a decade, his presence in Dubai was deeply embedded, not through visibility, but through structure. Arman built his position the way many ultra-wealthy individuals do, across layers. A logistics company registered in one jurisdiction, a holding structure in another. Real estate assets distributed across multiple cities. But with Dubai as the anchor, not because it was the largest market, but because it was the most efficient. In the early 2000s, Dubai offered him something few places could. Speed. Company formation took days, not months. Capital could move with minimal friction. Regulatory clarity, while not always transparent, was predictable enough to operate within. For someone managing cross-border operations between Europe and Asia, that predictability translated directly into margin. So he expanded. A waterfront property became 2, then 3. Office space transitioned from leased to owned. Residency permits were secured, renewed, and eventually extended to family members. Over time, Dubai stopped being a strategic outpost and became a central node in his global system. But systems, by definition, are sensitive to change. The first signal wasn't dramatic. It came in the form of additional documentation requests from European banking partners. Nothing unusual on the surface, just more detailed disclosures, source of funds clarifications, beneficial ownership breakdowns. That required more precision than before. At the same time, transaction timelines began to stretch. What once cleared in days started taking weeks. Compliance reviews became iterative rather than procedural. Each delay, in isolation, was manageable. But collectively, they introduced something Arman had not accounted for: friction, not within Dubai itself, but in how Dubai connected to the rest of his financial network. Then came the second layer. Global tax frameworks were evolving. Information-sharing agreements between jurisdictions expanded. Structures that once operated quietly in parallel were now being cross-referenced. The advantage was no longer in simply choosing the right location, but in managing how all locations interacted. Dubai hadn't changed overnight, but the world around it had, and that shift altered the equation. Arman began to notice that maintaining a large centralized presence in a single jurisdiction was starting to introduce concentration risk, even one as optimized as Dubai. Not because Dubai had become unstable, but because stability elsewhere was becoming conditional. So the adjustments began. Subtly at first. A planned acquisition in Dubai was postponed, then redirected toward Southern Europe. One of his holding entities was restructured. Split across 2 jurisdictions instead of 1. Banking relationships expanded beyond the Gulf region, rebalancing toward institutions with deeper integration into European regulatory systems. None of these moves were reactive. They were anticipatory. By 2024, the changes became more visible, at least internally. His time in Dubai decreased, not eliminated, but redistributed. Instead of long, continuous stays, his presence became segmented, aligned with specific operational needs rather than default residency. The properties remained. The businesses continued to function. From the outside, nothing appeared different, but the center of gravity had shifted. Dubai was no longer the core. It was one component among many. What makes Arman's case significant isn't the scale of his wealth, or even the specifics of his decisions. It's the pattern. Because his reasoning doesn't rely on a single trigger. It reflects a broader recalibration happening across a particular class of individuals. Those who operate within highly interconnected financial systems, where efficiency is measured not just by returns, but by optionality. And optionality, in this context, means one thing: never being overexposed to a single environment, no matter how optimized it once seemed. But if individuals like Arman are restructuring in this way, the question becomes less about personal strategy and more about systemic pressure, because when multiple actors independently arrive at the same conclusion, it usually points to something deeper than preference. It suggests a shift in the underlying architecture itself. What Arman adjusted at an individual level begins to make more sense when viewed against the broader architecture of global finance, an architecture that has been quietly rewiring itself over the past decade. For most of the early 2000s, the system operated on asymmetry. Different jurisdictions offered different advantages, and the gaps between them were wide enough to be strategically exploited. Low-tax environments attracted capital. High-regulation economies provided legal protection. And individuals with sufficient resources could position themselves between these systems, extracting efficiency from the differences. Dubai thrived inside that asymmetry. It wasn't just a destination. It was a connector, a place where capital could pause, restructure, and then move again, often with fewer constraints than elsewhere. Its value was not only in what it offered internally, but in how effectively it interfaced with everything outside. But asymmetry doesn't last forever. Over time, global institutions began to compress those differences. Information sharing agreements expanded across borders. Financial transparency initiatives, many coordinated through organizations like the OECD, introduced new reporting standards that made it increasingly difficult to isolate financial activity within a single jurisdiction. Frameworks such as the Common Reporting Standard, CRS, didn't eliminate offshore structures, but they changed how visible those structures became. And visibility, at this level, alters behavior. Because once financial positions are no longer compartmentalized, the risk is no longer local. It becomes systemic. At the same time, another layer of pressure began to build. European economies, particularly those within the European Union, started to refine their approach to capital retention. Not through overt restrictions, but through increasingly sophisticated policy design. Tax incentives were restructured. Residency programs were recalibrated. Legal frameworks became more integrated across member states. The objective wasn't to compete directly with places like Dubai. It was to reduce the incentive to leave in the first place, and in some cases, to encourage return. This created a subtle but powerful shift. Instead of a one-directional flow of wealth moving toward low-friction jurisdictions, capital began to circulate more dynamically. High-net-worth individuals no longer treated relocation as a permanent decision, but as a reversible configuration. Residency became modular, presence became strategic, and geography, which once defined financial identity, started to lose its permanence. But there was another variable, less visible, but equally influential. Global geopolitics. Over the past few years, the reintroduction of sanctions regimes, capital controls, and trade fragmentation has redefined what neutral ground actually means. Jurisdictions that once operated comfortably between global powers are now being evaluated through a different lens, not just for efficiency, but for alignment. Dubai has historically positioned itself as neutral, open to capital from multiple regions, flexible in its partnerships, efficient in its execution. But neutrality, in an increasingly polarized environment, becomes harder to maintain without consequence, not because the system fails, but because external systems begin to impose conditions. For individuals managing large, internationally exposed portfolios, this introduces a new type of calculation. Not where is the best place to be, but how exposed is any one place to forces beyond its control. And this is where the idea of centralization begins to break down. Because centralization assumes stability. It assumes that a single hub can reliably anchor multiple streams of activity without becoming a point of vulnerability. But when the external environment becomes less predictable, that assumption weakens. What replaces it is distribution. Assets spread across jurisdictions, legal structures layered across systems, physical presence divided, not out of indecision, but as a form of insulation. In this model, no single location carries the full weight of risk. And that includes Dubai. This doesn't diminish its importance. In many ways, it remains one of the most efficient environments for certain types of activity, particularly in trade, logistics, and regional finance. Its infrastructure is intact. Its policies remain competitive. Its appeal, on the surface, is unchanged. But its role has evolved, from primary hub to strategic node. And that evolution is not driven by weakness. It's driven by adaptation, both of the city and of the individuals who use it. The result is a system that looks stable from the outside, but operates very differently beneath the surface. A system where movement is constant, but rarely visible. Where decisions are made not in reaction to crisis, but in anticipation of constraint. And where the absence of obvious disruption can sometimes obscure the presence of deeper transformation. But structural change doesn't remain confined to systems. Over time, it begins to shape behavior, and eventually, it reshapes perception itself. Structural changes rarely announce themselves in dramatic ways. They accumulate quietly, through policy shifts, delayed transactions, altered incentives, until they begin to affect something less visible than capital flows. Perception. For individuals like Arman, the shift is not experienced as a single moment of realization. It emerges gradually, through a growing awareness that the environment no longer behaves the way it used to. Predictability, once taken for granted, starts to fragment. Decisions that were previously straightforward begin to require second-order thinking, not just what works now, but what continues to work under pressure. Every jurisdiction, no matter how efficient, is no longer evaluated in isolation. It is assessed based on how it might respond to external stress. And that introduces a subtle form of cognitive strain. Because the ultra-wealthy are not simply managing assets, they are managing exposure across systems that are becoming increasingly interdependent. A regulatory adjustment in one region can ripple across structures in another. A geopolitical shift can alter the viability of an entire strategy. In that environment, confidence becomes conditional. Not lost, but recalibrated. Dubai, in this context, is not perceived as unstable, but it is no longer perceived as self-contained. Its advantages are still real: speed, infrastructure, flexibility. But they are now weighed against variables that exist beyond its borders, and that changes behavior in ways that are difficult to quantify. Time horizons shorten. Commitments become more reversible. What was once built for permanence is now designed for optionality. This shift doesn't produce panic. It produces caution. A quieter, more controlled response. But over time, that caution compounds. Because when enough individuals begin to operate under the same assumptions, even independently, the collective outcome starts to resemble coordination. Not through communication, but through alignment of incentives. And this is where the psychological dimension begins to intersect with systemic reality. Markets don't just respond to data, they respond to expectations about the future. If a critical mass of high net worth individuals begins to assume that no single jurisdiction can maintain long-term dominance without exposure to external risk, then the idea of permanence itself starts to erode, not visibly, not immediately, but structurally. And once permanence is questioned, behavior shifts again. Investment becomes more fluid. Residency becomes more strategic. Presence becomes temporary. This doesn't trigger collapse, it triggers something more subtle. A slow redistribution of certainty. And that redistribution doesn't stay confined to those at the top. Because systems, once recalibrated at the highest level, tend to cascade downward, affecting markets, pricing, and eventually, the assumptions of those operating far, far below. Which raises a final, more unsettling question. If the people with the most access to information are quietly repositioning themselves, what does that imply about the direction of the system itself? There is no single moment where a system like this breaks, no headline that marks the transition, no visible line between stability and change. Instead, the shift happens in fragments, through decisions that appear rational in isolation, but collectively redefine the structure they operate within. Dubai is not collapsing. Its skyline remains intact. Its markets continue to function. Its appeal, on the surface, is still compelling. But what has changed is something less visible and far more consequential. The assumptions that once made it a central hub are no longer absolute. For a certain class of individuals, the question is no longer where is the best place to be. It has become how long any place can hold that position. And when that question enters the equation, behavior adapts accordingly. Not dramatically, not all at once, but persistently. The movement of the ultra-wealthy, in this sense, is not a signal of rejection. It's a signal of recalibration. A quiet acknowledgement that in a system defined by increasing complexity, Permanence itself may be the most fragile construct of all. And if even the most optimized environments are no longer treated as anchors, then the future of global wealth may not belong to any single place, but to those who never depend on one.